everyone. Back to Cat's Eye on the Future. We have a very special program this evening. Today we're having a conversation with Diana Paxon, author and pagan elder, and special guest we have asking a lot of questions and some interest is playing the role of John Q. Public is Esther, who lives here in Berkeley. So just to get started, we were discussing off air. I believe that Esther was kind of asking, so what was Asa true, or what was Diana actually talking about?
Yeah, I was asking that.
So over to you, Diana.
I was always interested in religion, and in college I was really trying for contact, for a real experience of spirituality, and I got a lot of really nice feelings, but I didn't get the really solid sense of connection that I was aiming for. It's sort of bits and pieces, and then I got out of college and realized that none of the churches that I was going to were giving me even as much as I had gotten in the college chapel, where we had a priest who really knew what he was doing. So at that time, at the same time, I had rather inadvertently ended up being one of the founding members of the Society for Creative Anachronism, and several of the other people were pagans, and so I started going to pagan events, and it eventually joined a study practice group that was being run by Marion Zimmer Bradley and her husband. And that was based on the work of Diane Fortune and the people from England from the earlier 20th century.
What work?
She wrote a whole slew of books, but all of which are still in print and are excellent. But she worked with what we call the Western esoteric tradition, which uses what the Europeans did with the Hebrew Kabbalah. So it retains authentic elements, but it does a lot of other things that probably the traditional Jewish scholars would not agree with. In any case, I found that was really beginning to get me where I wanted to go in terms of being able to sense spiritual energy. And it was a time when a lot of other people were discovering paganism. And so I went with that. After a couple of years doing more general studies, one of the women in our group wanted a coming of age ceremony and asked me to write it for her, which I did, and all of the women from the group participated in this. And I had heard of the concept of the triple goddess. It was not well known at that time, if this can be believed. This was in 1978. I used that as the basis for the ritual. And
what is the triple goddess?
Okay, maiden, mother, and crone.
Oh, that.
Right, that. So, I mean, it's become pretty widespread at this point. We did the ritual. We all had a strong sense of connection to this really powerful female energy. And we were all kind of blown away by this and decided to keep working together and see where we could go with it. So this ended up turning into a Wiccan coven, and which is still going. And so for a while I was working with what is called women's spirituality as my main practice. I worked with the Kabbalistic system. I worked with neo-shamanism, and all of these gave me very useful skills. Towards the end of the 80s, I was at a workshop where we did a trance journey, where you go in and, how do I explain trance journey? It's sort of like a waking dream. You have some ability to direct it, but you're in a very deep, relaxed state where you're not very aware of the outside world. In this inner journey, I met the Norse god Odin, somewhat to my surprise. And at that time, one of the things I wanted to learn about were the Northern European magical traditions. And in this encounter, he basically said he would be my teacher. So if this is hard to get your head around, think of it as the same kind of experience you have in a dream, except that I was aware of who and where I was and what I was doing. And
Like a lucid dream.
yeah, exactly. So after that, I thought, all right, the best way to get started would be by studying the runes, which was the Norse alphabet, that in which each of the symbols also has a name and a meaning. And it's used, it can be used for divination, it can be used for focusing energy, for doing a lot of things. And so the Bay Area has always been full of lots and lots of really interesting people. And so all I had to do was to say, to pass the word around that I was going to start a rune class. And I got 15 really great people, one of whom was getting his doctorate in Scandinavian studies and knew all the background. And somebody else was doing Anglo-Saxon. We had a couple of really good poets. And between their input and the fact that I was meditating on Odin with each new set of runes, and I was getting all kinds of wonderful insights, by the end of the year, we had a shared background in Northern culture. And that eventually turned into a kindred, which is what sort of the Norse equivalent of a coven.
Or a congregation.
Or a congregation, yeah. The terms usually used for it are, for the religion, are either asatru, which is being faithful to the Norse gods, or heathenry. The heathens were the people originally it was used as a Germanic equivalent of Gentile, i.e. people who weren't Christian. And so it's the old people out on the heath who are still practicing the old religion when the people in the cities have turned Christian. So that was at the beginning of the 90s, and since then my practice has come to increasingly focus on the Northern religion.
Oh. Now, we were talking off the air, and you had been asking me, like, did I really believe that these beings exist, or where, like, do they live somewhere in the sky in Valhalla, and maybe is Loki really bound under the earth? And really, actually, very good questions. And I said that I sort of believe that they're there somewhere, but I don't exactly put them in exact time and space. And I was wondering what your feelings were on that.
That's a really good question. And you're certainly not the first to have asked it. I do not believe that there is a physical Valhalla or a physical heaven, or as, in fact, some people who are into Asatru have said, a planet out on outer space, sort of like the Thor movies.
Oh, I thought Marvel made that up.
Yeah, well, no, probably not. I think that whole idea of gods from outer space has been around for a while, unfortunately. Anyway, there's more than one kind of reality, and so we could think of it as another dimension. And the human senses, there's a continuum. I won't even say that the human senses don't perceive it, because with some of our senses we can perceive, for instance, the body's energy. There's a lot of people who work with manipulating energies in the body. Sometimes people combine it with massage. If you practice and learn how to sense it, you can move your hands over somebody and feel where the energy is strong and where it's less strong. So there's a continuum from the most solidly physical through energy, and then from there on it gets into things that are not so easily perceived by any of the physical senses. You develop an awareness, and a lot of spiritual practice in many traditions is directed towards learning to identify and work with, use these inner senses. I've been, as a result of all of these things I was talking about earlier, I've been working with trying how to learn and teach what we call trance work, which is a state of mind other than the one you think you usually are in. I think it's probably a basic way to put it. I mean, we have many different trance states that everybody uses. Dreaming is one, or altered other states. Driving a car and realizing you've arrived without remembering anything that happened in between. You were in a slightly altered state. Part of your mind was thinking about something else. So, again, trances and states of consciousness are also a continuum. So, I wrote a book called Transportation, which addresses how do you start from the beginning and learn how to do this. One of the other things that I've been trying to work on over the years is the thing called transpossession, where you let the personality of a god speak through you. And so where the gods exist, pagans argue a lot about whether they're transcendent, i.e. out there, or immanent, which is in here. And usually the answer is both. Because certainly they are out there in the sense that many different people at the same or at different times can have an experience of contact with the same God. But they are also in here in the sense that when we learn to quiet our conscious minds and listen, we can, quote, hear words or receive impressions that we know don't come from our own minds because they're different from anything that we have ever known ourselves to think. So the answer is yes. They certainly present themselves to us as being distinct personalities. Now, a lot of religions believe that there's a kind of an overall God stuff, the absolute, the divine source, that does not have personality. And monotheistic religions sometimes try to say that that's what they're worshiping. But the minute you try to talk about it and give it a pronoun, you've already started to personify it. And we as humans relate through persons. There are mystical states of consciousness in which you can touch and experience that divine source, but you can't do much with it, aside from coming back and going, wow, yeah, there's something out there. This will help me from getting too discouraged about life. But if you actually want to interact and work with it, you need a person to talk to. And I think that's why we perceive the gods as persons.
Some of what you said leads into what I had originally thought we might talk about today, which you were talking about how, the trance work and things, but since this show is not only about looking into the future, but kind of divination of various sorts, both actual kind of metaphysical and spiritual, but even, political and observing current events and whatnot. But I was wondering, I know that you've been working on, or have been working for many years on sort of an oracular system that came from the Norse and came from some of the sagas. And I'd like you to talk about some of the history and how that developed, and then, how you're using it today.
Okay. There's a book there. I first found out about this in a book by Hilda Ellis Davidson about Viking culture, and Gods and Myths of the Vikings. Book. Yeah, it's an excellent book, and she was talking about something she called Seith, which is a general term for magical practices. One of the practices it includes is Spey, which is related to seeing. And what the seeresses see is the answer to questions. And I thought it would be really, really nifty if we could figure out how to do that. In the old days, as you might recall from the book, the seers would go around with a group, and they go from place to place, and everybody would gather, and they would do their ceremony and answer everybody's questions, and then they would go on to the next neighborhood. And I thought, well, we have these pagan festivals in various places. If we could get a team together, we could go around and do the same thing for everybody. And there's a couple of good descriptions in the sagas, and I put those together with a number of other sources and came up with a ritual format. And we found that it would work, and we started taking it to festivals, and we've been doing that at the PantheaCon festival, for instance, ever since that festival began. That's PantheaCon is 20 years old now, and we've been doing it since a few years before that. Mm-hmm. And in the course of all that time, I've done workshops in a lot of different places, and people have developed their own variations on the practice and continue to use it. So it's been quite a success, and I wrote up all of the history of that and both ancient and contemporary in a book called The Way of the Oracle, which came out a couple of years ago.
And you can buy on.
And which you can buy it on Amazon, or you can order it from Wiser Books, Red Wheel Wiser Books.
So I have to confess that I was around for a lot of this, and I was one of the, if not the original group, pretty much the original group, pretty close to founding of the Rofnir, which is the name of the particular.
Well, Rofnar is the name of the kindred.
Yes.
And we call our working Seith group Seithyaller.
Okay. It didn't have that name yet, so when I was working with it, but I know that
isn't
if you want
Seithyaller doesn't that refer to a place where they do their work?
It refers to the chair. The chair is called the Seithyaller. You got it. You remembered that. That's great.
That gives you a great end to what I was about to ask, which can you describe a little more about the process?
Yeah. Okay. In the saga of Eric the Red, one of the details, and it gives a lot of interesting details, that is described is that for the seeress to do her work, she needed a special chair, so they constructed a sort of a platform thing.
What's special about it?
Well, it seems to be elevated, and this one also had a cushion stuffed with hen's feathers. Whether this was just to make her comfortable or whether there was some kind of esoteric symbolism to it, I don't know.
Do you use a cushion stuffed with hen's feathers?
We have actually a pillow stuffed with goose feathers.
Oh.
And which also is certainly useful. It's a very hard seat. One of the things we did fairly early on was find somebody who could build things, and he created this elevated chair which bolts together and can be taken apart and transported to places. And what's interesting is that although it doesn't even stay together as a chair between sessions, once the chair has been put together, it has an energy that people who are sensitive to this perceive.
What sort of energy?
It's sort of a buzz.
Oh.
It feels like it has an identity and knows it. You know, sometimes there are things that items or furniture or objects that have been used a lot, and they have a kind of an identity that you go, oh, this is a thing. It's not just this is pretty subjective, but the act of getting into the chair where you are now elevated, you're in a different physical relationship to everybody around you, becomes a cue. At the very least, it becomes a cue that now it's time to shift gears and go into an altered state. And a lot of trance work, in my opinion, is a matter of training yourself to respond to certain cues. When you approach the dinner table, if the dinner smells really good, that's a cue. Your stomach starts reacting, your mouth starts salivating. If you're working with a particular deity and want to feel their presence, singing a song you associate with that deity brings him or her to mind. For that matter, music is very powerful that way. If there's a song you learned or that was popular on a summer where something really great happened, every time you hear that song forever after, it'll bring it back to you. Now that's how that kind of cueing works, and you can intentionally set those up and train yourself to respond to them.
Isn't there a song in Eric Saga?
Yes, there is. The seeress, she's come the night before, she's become connected to the atmosphere of the place and to the spirits of the place, and they're all ready to go, and they get her hoisted up onto the safe seat, and she says, okay, now somebody has to sing the song. Apparently she has been trained to go into trance in response to this particular song. And one of the everybody kind of looks at each other, and finally one of the women says, well, when I was a little girl, my old nurse taught me the song, but I'm a Christian now and I don't think I should sing it. And the seeress replies, well, I think you could sing a song and not be any worse a woman than you were before, but why don't you talk to the guy who owns the farm? Well, the reason they called this whole thing is because they're having a famine. In Greenland, they were very dependent on the game, and apparently it's all disappeared. And we don't know what he said to her, but I suspect it was something like, look, you have to live with all these people through the winter, and if we're starving because we couldn't get the seeress to tell us what's going on, it's going to be very uncomfortable for you. And so, whatever he says, she comes back and she says, okay, I'll sing the song. And she sings it, and she sings it very well. And the seeress goes into trance, and she can feel the presence of spirits around her, and she tells them the famine's going to stop quite soon, and then she says to the girl, and you sang really well, and so I'm going to tell you your future, which in terms of the plot of the saga is probably why that scene is in there, because she's a major character. But, yes, so the song was clearly a cue, and that was one of the reasons that when we put the ritual together, we stressed having different pieces of music at different points.
Didn't she have a special outfit, the seeress?
Yep. This particular episode is not only the best description of this ceremony, but it's the best description of any ceremony in terms of details, nitty-gritty details. Yeah, she has a blue cloak with stones, some kind of precious or semi-precious stones set in it, and she has a hat of cat skin, black lamb skin lined with white cat fur, and she has some shoes with tin tips on the laces, and she has a bag for her stuff that she does save with, and
What sort of stuff would be in her bag?
Well, that they didn't tell us. My guess is that it's the kind of thing you find in descriptions of folk magic in general, which is a whole nother lecture.
Oh, that's okay.
For folk magic, which is another thing that I've been trying to study, one of the places, there are more studies of surviving bits of folk magic in Scandinavia and other places. And when you look, there's some Anglo-Saxon charms. When you look cross-culturally, you find that certain kinds of procedures seem to show up again and again, because that seems to be how the human mind works. And so herbs are very important. Sometimes precious stones are used. Amulets are made up. You can do.
Now, what is an amulet?
For that, well, I'll give you a very brief. It's a thing with things inscribed on it that are magic. But if you actually want to know, her husband
has written a book
Has
on
written a
on
wonderful
ambulance
book.
and stones,
Yeah.
and I think that one's actually out. I'll have to check, and if it is out, I'll put up the link on the show pages, and if it's not, I'll try to give a projected when it will be out. But I can give you the title.
I've seen excerpts from it, and it's excellent.
All the music used on the show today is from musicalley.com, your source for free-to-air music for podcasts. The artists place their music up for free to air in hopes that you, the listener, will visit their site and purchase some of their outstanding musical offerings. So after the show, why not visit musicalley.com and explore their extensive playlist?
And she sings, she goes home in the evening with the dew all on her wings.
Have questions? The cards have answers. If you would like a personal reading with Melody, just go to my website, melodipsychicreadings.com. That's Melody with an I, psychicreadings.com for information, or email me at melodyreader@gmail.com. Readings are available using Skype, phone, email, or even in person if you are lucky to live in Ireland. Why not find out what special messages the cards have just for you and book a private reading today?
And see me from beneath the sea, the best in all of Ireland. See me from beneath the sea, the best in all of Ireland.
What kind of questions would people ask, both in the past and what kind of questions do you encounter now when doing this recreation of this ceremony?
For the Oracle book, I not only looked again at the analysis that I had done when we were starting to put this together, but I also found a very good book on the Delphic Oracle, where the guy had collected all the answers ascribed to the Delphic Oracle that had been written down anywhere. And he divided them into probably legendary. For instance, any Delphic oracle that appears in one of the Greek plays is probably legendary and has a lot to do with what the plot requires it to say.
Mm-hmm.
Then there were some that are just kind of weird and are considered quasi-historical, and then there's the other ones that are probably historical. Probably historical ones, like the ones that we have reported in the sagas, tend to be pretty practical. They're when will the famine end? Should I move to Iceland? Will I win this battle? Who should I marry, or where should I find a wife for one of my sons or daughters? All of the how do I get along in life questions that we still have today. Now, our SPAY group has been doing this ceremony not only at various festivals, but 4 times a year we do it at a local Unitarian church. And those are small enough that we can usually have somebody with a computer to actually take down the answers. And so we actually have transcripts of our own sessions. So I analyzed those and compared them to my analysis of the Delphic Oracle and the sagas. And indeed, people are still asking the same sort of thing. Should I move to New Jersey? Will I find a relationship? Will I find a job? And the human mind and human needs have not changed a lot over the centuries. What I have found, however, is that a lot of the answers to the what's going to happen kind of question are conditional. Now, in Germanic, there's a very interesting book by a guy called Bauschatz called The Well and the Tree, where he's analyzing Germanic concepts of time and magic and lots of other cool stuff. And he points out that in old Germanic grammar, you really don't have a future. You put verbs together to make a future. And I noticed that we were getting a lot of answers that went, I see 3 roads. If you go on this one, this will happen. If you go on this one, this will happen. If you go on this one, this will happen. So what we were usually getting was not absolute predictions, although occasionally you'd get an absolute yes or no. There's an overwhelming sense of an answer. What we were getting was probabilities. And that made me think of the one of the most famous Delphic answers, which is the answer to King Croesus of Lydia, who was the one who, the question everybody knows about is, if I cross the Halys River, should I attack the Persian Empire?
A great empire will end, won't it?
Yes, you got it. Okay, so actually there were 3 questions. The first, Croesus wanted to know which of the many oracles in the Mediterranean world knew their stuff. And so the first question was, 100 days after the messengers set out with all the gifts they're going to pay you with, what am I doing? And the Delphic oracle got that he was boiling the meat of a lamb and a turtle in a bronze vessel. Okay. So he went, okay, Delphi has got the stuff. I'll ask them my real question, which is about Persia. And the answer was, if you cross the Halys River, a great empire will fall, as you said. Well, he crossed the Halys River, and he fought the Persians, and he got creamed. In fact, he got captured. And when he was finally ransomed and got home again, he sent another embassy to Delphi, which was basically saying, what? And actually, it was more whiny than that. It's things like, is it the custom of the Delphic oracle to try to confuse people, or, were the gods lying to me? What? And, he had reason to complain. So,
oh, but you had such a great empire.
the oracle clearly doesn't know what to say. And first it's, well, it's your fault because you misinterpreted it. And then, well, actually, Apollo tried to get the fates to change it, but all they could do was partial. And oh, by the way, your ancestor did something wrong, and therefore you're being punished. It was not a satisfactory answer, and I think that the explanation is that at the time when the middle question was asked, the only answer the oracle could give was, one of you is going to win, and one of you is going to lose. And the outcome was determined by factors that had not come into being yet, so they couldn't be predicted.
Yeah, I see this and this has been on the show too, and some of the readings, particularly in trying to predict current events, you often get a sort of a non-answer that sort of says, yet to be decided.
Yeah.
And that's because when people are involved, decisions have to be made, and sometimes until certain decisions are made, it doesn't happen. I mean, I personally don't feel the future is fixed, and I'm getting the impression that in the Norse, or the Germanic view, that is the same way. It's more of a if-then.
Yeah, which is interesting because the common perception of the Norse perspective is that they were all into doom and fate. And when you really analyze that, there is a ability to recognize when something is most probable. For instance, in the Volsunga saga, Sigmund, the old king Sigmund, has been defeated in battle, and he's bleeding to death, and his wife finds him on the battlefield and says, okay, let's get you bandaged up and into shelter. And he says, no, my sword broke. Odin gave me lots of victories before, but clearly the time has come now for me to go and be with my ancestors. So that's not actually that he's doomed, because it sounds as if she could have saved him. But he has decided, okay, my life now has a proper ending. So sometimes knowing when to let go is the answer. Sometimes fighting on, even though you know you're probably going to fail, is the answer, as in the Battle of Maldon. the interesting thing is to try to figure out how that relates to the concept of Ragnarok.
Mm-hmm.
Which was another one of your questions.
Yeah. If you look at a lot of religious systems, they have a theory of ages of the earth. And in fact, if you look at geology, science has a concept of ages of the earth. That at long intervals, usually very long intervals, something will happen and the whole environmental system will completely flip. Extinction incidents, meteors, major things happen, it all changes. So I think that the concept of Ragnarok is related to that understanding. That in Hinduism you have that concept, the Hopi have that concept, that awareness that the history of the earth has had things change. They change over very, very lengthy periods, or at least they're supposed to change over very, very lengthy periods. I think Ragnarok is a recognition that at some point the current environmental, ecological setup will change, and everything that evolved in the course of that, including modern humans and all our cultures and our religions and our gods, or at least the forms in which we see our gods, all of those will disappear together, and some new system will evolve. If humans survive into the next age, they might be able to carry more of the old culture along with them. In previous ages, there wasn't any species that had a way of recording and remembering. At least I don't think anybody's talked to the snakes and the various. There are some animals that have survived from the earlier ages, but not many. So the Earth is going to survive. One of the things that has a lot of us worried, of course, today is whether our age of the Earth is going to be allowed to live out its allotted time span. And my personal opinion is that one of the reasons that the gods in general and the Norse gods in particular have become much more active in trying to get through to people is because...
Wait, they've become more active?
That's my perception. Because I keep running into people who either weren't particularly religious at all, or they were happy being some other kind of pagan, and then usually Odin just sort of appears in their life, and they keep running into him until they start talking to him. And as the leader of the gods who are going to be fighting at Ragnarok, I think he is trying to get through to us to get us to fight whatever we might be doing to hurry things along. So, in the old days it was, let's fight to keep stop us from blowing ourselves up with nuclear winter. Now it's global warming.
So you think Odin opposes climate change?
Yes. Well, he opposes climate change that is caused by humans. Yeah, that I do. And if a meteor hits us and we're all expiring, I will be very sad, but I won't feel guilty. I don't want to feel guilty as we go down because we didn't do our part to fight. Now, one of the reasons that I use this imagery, the Ragnarok is presented as a war between the gods and the giants. The giants are also spiritual persons. They are closer to the natural forces. And mostly humans don't interact directly with them. They interact with them through the gods, or the gods and the giants interact. And there are lots and lots of giants. And they're associated with the mountains or the frost or the fire, and so forth. These are natural forces, and some of them are very strong, and some of them can destroy. when they get out of balance, they're really destructive. And we can weather the normal swings, but when we do something to upset matters, then the balance tips. Now, when we had the Oakland firestorm here in, 97,
92,
whenever it was, one of the reasons why it was so severe was because normally in our ecosystem, you have wildfires every so often, and they clear out the underbrush, and new things grow. If you don't clear out the underbrush, when a fire does come through, it's much, much hotter, and you have a firestorm. And watching the fire come down that ravine where 24 comes through, you could, I fancied I could feel that kind of destructive, greedy rage of the fire spirits. And apparently some of the people in the Indian Ocean tidal wave, some of the fishermen who have a more nature-based religion, they felt, not that you can actually blame the tidal wave and earthquake on global warming, but at least I don't think so. But they could feel that voracious energy in the tidal wave. So my theory is that if things get too unbalanced, the only Jotnar left will be the unbalanced, greedy ones. And those are the ones who come against the gods at Ragnarok. For all I know, although it's not mentioned, some of the other giants might be fighting on the side of the gods.
This is a great lead-in to something else that was mentioned off-air, and that would be the position or the sort of effects or energy of Loki.
Yeah, that's something that has caused a lot of discussion. Part of the problem is that the Victorian writers who started writing up Norse mythology looked at Loki and identified him with the Christian devil.
That's a ridiculous comparison.
Well, yeah, it is. But, that...
I wonder whether it would be wise to tell the listeners why that's a ridiculous comparison. Do they already know, do you think?
I mean, the devil is a Christian concept. But they looked at Norse mythology and decided that Loki must play the same role, which is based on an assumption that a mythology has to have somebody in that role. Now, what mythologies do seem to need, if you look at lots of different ones, is a trickster. And Loki is definitely that. And there's...
So would you say that he subverts established orders, whether they're good or bad, rather than that he's evil?
Well, oddly enough, if you actually look at the myths, Loki does lots of disruptive things. They usually end up in, when he is then required to fix it, he fixes it by arranging to create things that are useful to the gods. So Thor has a hammer because Loki paid for doing something by getting the dwarves to make it. And so the trickster figure has this necessary, shake things up, and in the shaking up, the results can often be better. This may be disturbing while you're going through it. But the other thing is that mythological time is not like linear human time. And so all parts of a mythology can be going on or can be accessed at the same time. I mean, Christianity works this way too, because Jesus is always on the cross, and he's always resurrected, and he's always teaching, and somebody who is working with Jesus can connect with him at any one of those places. When Catholics are doing Stations of the Cross, they are connecting with him in that part of the myth.
That's not accurate to my experience of Christian practice, but okay.
Well, again, there's lots of different Christian practices.
Yeah, there are.
Yeah, and there are a lot of theological, for some Christians, that's probably a better way to say it, and certainly at some times there have been, especially some of the medieval stuff, where it was definitely, some branches of Catholicism invite people, especially during Holy Week, to experience all of those parts of the myth. Mm-hmm. So in my meditations on the Norse myths, there is a sense in which Odin is always hanging from the world tree and taking up the runes. And one can connect with him in that action and feel that particular energy.
Can you tell us a bit more about that? Odin and the hanging on the tree?
Odin, one of his particular things is to wander around seeking wisdom. And if seeking wisdom involves putting himself through an ordeal or making a sacrifice, that's what he will do. One of the hanging on the world tree and getting the runes is one of the major actions. And it resembles a shamanic ordeal a lot. In a lot of the literature on shamanism, you have reports that the typical initiatory experience is a vision or a deep meditation in which the shaman perceives himself as going through death and being put back together. So some writers, I think Hilda Ellis Davidson among them, has looked at Odin on the tree. Mircea Eliade, writing on shamanism, has also made this observation, that is reminiscent of a shamanic initiation. Of course, a lot of Norse scholars say, no, it's nothing of the kind. But that's scholarship. You're always going to find multiple points of view, and the discussion can often lead to illumination. Sometimes not. But in any case, so Odin is 9 days and nights hanging on the tree. And one of he goes through a death, a kind of a death. How a god can die is a mystery. But he is hanged on the tree. He is speared with his own spear. He is sacrificed to himself. So one level of his evolution is sacrificed to release another. That's one possibility. He comes out of it living, possibly improved. And in the course of that experience, he acquires the runes, which are an alphabet, but they are also entities, concepts, focuses of energy. And when he comes back with them, one image that is not in the lore, but some people have come up with, is that since the world tree is above the well of Weird, maybe the runes are floating in the well, and maybe he scoops them up out of the well. So they're coming up out of the source of Urlag, which is sort of like fate. It's things coming into being. It's a really deep and interesting set of things to meditate on.
I'm going to say briefly, what is the world tree?
Well, you actually, one of the things I really liked about the Marvel Thor was the world tree as this system of galaxies. Gosh, that was pretty. But a lot of religions have used the shape of a tree as a kind of map on which to organize alternate worlds and dimensions. And so our world on the Norse world tree is sort of in the middle. That's why we call it Midgard or Middle Earth. And
middle where? Is it in the trunk or?
It's sort of when you try to draw it, you sort of look at it as sort of surrounding the trunk or being in front of on one side of the trunk or something. And the other, Asgard's at the top of the tree, the Well of Weird's at the bottom, and the Land of the Dead is at the bottom. And there are other worlds that are sort of distributed around.
Are they on the branches? Are they like Christmas ornaments?
That's one way of looking at it, yeah. A lot of people have tried to make a diagram of it. I don't know of any actually from the ancient period. We just have literary descriptions. And
I recall reading that it had its roots in all of the world.
Yeah, that's in some of the references. So it's a little unclear. These days, mostly we kind of lay it out in a more ordinary tree shape. In Hebrew Kabbalism, you also have the tree of life, and you also have quote worlds arranged upon it. Although in that version, as a result of the fall, the human world was taken from farther up and put down at the bottom. So there's a value judgment there that we don't find in the Norse version. But some of the Siberian stuff, they use a tree, and so trees are really ancient symbols for humans.
Esther had another question that's kind of veering off on another topic, but staying with gods, and I thought it was one that a lot of people might have, and that is, she wondered is Thor? We sort of see Thor, and I've actually seen this description of he's the god driving the red truck with the beer can.
Yeah,
and the hamburger.
I can see that.
But also, but she was wondering, is he like actually stupid? Which I mean, no. I would not usually. Yeah,
no, actually he's not. There is one. Is it Truthless Ball?
I'm not sure, but she wanted an example of where Thor is.
Yeah. Okay, there's one of the poems in the Elder Edda, in which while Thor is away, a dwarf.
This is the Alvasmal.
Alvasmal, you got it. Okay, you know things.
Go ahead and sum it up.
Yeah, the dwarf has gotten into Thor's hall while he's away. And apparently he got welcomed in before they realized that he'd come to try and carry off Thor's daughter. And that's why I'm thinking through. So Thor can't kick him out, at least not till morning. And so instead, he gets him into a riddle contest. And he managed to keep him going with riddles until morning, and then with the dawn light, the dwarf turned to stone, and that takes care of that.
Showing both the wisdom to do the riddles and the wisdom to realize if he can just keep this guy talking, eventually
and the self-control not to do what he clearly wants to do is what the guy in the red truck usually wants to do if somebody messes with his daughter.
Yeah.
Thor has a lot more dimensions than most people usually see. In fact, we're probably going to be doing a ritual for him next year at PantheaCon that will display all of these. He is, among other things, a healer and a magician. There's a couple of references to
Really?
that. Yeah.
Where's that?
There's a standing stone someplace in Scandinavia, Felda would know, which has a inscription on it which says something like Siddhi Thor, and which translates more or less to Thor work safe, Thor do magic. He's in the story in which he sort of imposes himself on the hospitality of a poor peasant who turns out has nothing to feed him.
So they eat his goats.
So they eat his goats, and after and he says, just don't break any of the bones.
So of course the son breaks one of the bones.
Yeah, because the marrow will be marrow is something that modern people mostly don't understand. Why this is, if you're in a fat-starved environment, it's very good. So in the morning, Thor puts the goats back together, and one of them is lame because the bone was cracked. I assume that it healed, because in other references, the goats are doing just fine.
Mm-hmm.
But so this is an example of him doing something very magical. And a lot of people I know have worked with Thor when they were in For instance, one of my friends had a serious infection, and she had fever, like, and it was burning her up, and she visualized Thor coming in with his hammer and a lot of little thurissage runes. It's the sound that with it which his name starts, and he
is that the
attacking.
Is that the thorn shape?
Yeah.
That looks sort of like a key?
Yeah. So she visualized, she called on Thor, and she wrote this beautiful poem for him, invoking him as healer to whack all of the infection germs, and visualized all those little thurissages rioting through her body and going whack, 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 whack. And she started healing from that time on. The fever went down, and she got better. So he is really much, much more interesting than he looks if all you read is the usual summaries of the mythology.
And what about Freya? I know she's often portrayed as a love goddess, but
she's also a witch.
Yeah.
She's love, magic, and war. There's actually a goddesses in a number of mythologies that, when you actually look at them, have those three characteristics. Freya, next to Odin, Freya is probably the most aggressive of the goddess of the Norse deities, probably because A, Christianity doesn't do so well with sexual love, and B, everybody can relate to a love goddess, and she's initially not so scary. But she is also the witch. She is the one who taught save magic to the Aesir, and probably taught it to Odin. We think that he probably taught her the runes in exchange. And she's very bright and vigorous and active, and also tends to turn up in people's lives unexpectedly. And they find that they are working with her even though they had no intention of doing so.
And what about Frigg? I know she's fairly popular as well.
Yeah, she's cool in several senses of the word. Frigg is the wife of Odin, and if all you've ever seen is Wagner's version of her, she comes across like the Greek Hera as a jealous wife. I don't actually see any evidence for that in the original lore. She's the one to whom he always comes back. And she has her own household, and she has her handmaidens, or sort of demigoddesses that live with her, who may be forms she takes when she goes out to do specific things, or maybe not. And she is, among other things, a goddess of house cleaning, however. If you've ever been to Scandinavia or Germany, they are fixated on house cleaning to an extent which, especially some of us over here aren't. I'm the descendant of German housewives who didn't keep house up to German standards. So there's a lot of guilt mixed up in this, but if you start working with Frigga, you find yourself cleaning. And I once was contacted by some people who were doing a book on California sacred sites, and they wanted a picture of a home altar. And somebody gave them my name and said, can we send a photographer over? So I thought, well, a home altar, it should be to Frigga. So I looked at the kitchen, and I cleared off the amount of kitchen table that I thought would be in the photo. And I set up a lovely altar to Frigga with candles and cookies and a horn, a drinking horn, and flowers, and it was really pretty. I could show you the picture of it downstairs. And the photographer was late. So then I thought, well, I might as well clear off the rest of the table because, So I cleared off the rest of the table. Still no photographer. So then I thought, well, the rest of the kitchen is looking pretty dismal, so I better start scrubbing. By the time the photographer finally got there, I had not only completely cleaned the kitchen, I'd scrubbed the floor. At this point, Frigga was apparently satisfied that it was worthy of her altar, and the photographer arrived and took a picture of it.
Hopefully, if you have a smaller photograph of that, I'd love to put that up on the site connecting to the page for the show.
I don't know if I can because they sent me a copy, but it's copyright.
Oh, okay. So we'll just have to mentally envision this lovely altar, and finally, I think while we're sort of going through this sort of brief overview of a few of the gods and goddesses, can you talk a little bit about Freyr, Freya's twin brother?
Right. He's become increasingly popular, at least in our community, in the past few years, and a lot of women really like him. He's one of the nicest of the gods. In fact, it is said of him that he never made maid or wife weep. So, unlike Odin, who loves them and leaves them, in his mythology. And Freyr also has many aspects, which we honored in a ritual at Pantheacon last year. Because he's not only Freya's brother, but he has his own kingdom. He has a connection to the dead, especially the male spirits. He's definitely concerned with the fertility of the earth. His usual traditional portrayal shows him with his masculine power, quite obvious. He was the patron god of the kings of Sweden, so he's got a sovereignty aspect. So he's really all over the place. In fact, most of the gods have a number of aspects, so you can't just say he's just a war god. Well, they're all war gods in one sense. He's just a fertility god. He's just this. They're all but they do these jobs in different ways. So,
and you, I think, were asking, did you have a question about the mounds and sitting on a mound and?
Oh yeah, you said that was useful, didn't you?
Yes, but if you could, we should get Diana's perspective as well. If you want to ask the question again, or if you want me to ask it.
I read somewhere that they were supposed to lie on top of a grave in order to work certain kinds of spay magic.
The example of that, there's the two examples that come to mind. There are the grave mounds of kings, and then there's just other people's grave mounds. And in Svipdag's Mahal, Svipdag is one of those young people in the common situation of having an evil stepmother. And she, to screw him up, lays on him the curse of having to get this unobtainable girl for his bride. So he goes and sits out, the utiseta, sitting out is the technical term, and sits out on the grave mound of his mother. Now, mothers, especially once they've passed on, are great sources of wisdom. And so she gives him scads of good advice and instructions on what he has to do in order to reach the other world where this maiden is living and what he's going to have to do to actually get to her. So sitting on the grave mound of a relative is definitely a thing. I have a friend who, when he went to Uppsala, he was Swedish, and he sat down on one of the king's grave mound and got a real sense of connection. But he then kind of freaked out and didn't really do much with it.
I remember.
Yeah,
well,
that was a good story.
Well, you're touching the other world, I guess, and in some ways the other world, there are a lot of legends in the Celts as well of sometimes, the other world and living humans don't always interact exactly as they expect. You may not get exactly what you expect to get out of it.
Yeah. Well, sometimes the powers have other ideas.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's, there are certain neighborhoods where you need to know what you're doing if you're going to get through them safely. There are neighborhoods in Oakland that, there's some places you don't go unless you look right and, have the right accent. There are some ways, don't walk like a victim. And really the same thing goes for the other world. It's useful to know how to talk to beings you meet there. Reading fairy tales is actually a good way to get the idea. If something asks you for help, you should probably give it. Always be polite to whatever you meet, but don't necessarily assume that because something looks pretty that it really is. For the transportation, we came up with this whole list of rules for getting along in the other world.
So, I know you've been working a little bit, or you were on, I think it's Herberger Saga, for an example of both somebody who goes and gets something from the dead, and who is also interesting in that she's a woman. Yeah,
this is very often these days, in the wake of feminism, people will take some historical setting and say, I'm going to have write about a girl, but she's going to be a warrior. In cases where it's very, very hard to really historically support a woman doing anything of the sort. And it always feels a little forced and unreal to me. So, on the other hand, I would really like to write about a warrior woman. So
Didn't the Vikings have warrior women, though?
Maybe. That's one of the things where the opinions are now changing a little bit, because they've been finding swords in... It used to be that if there was a sword in the grave, it must be a guy. But now they can do DNA analysis, and they're discovering some of the graves in which there are swords are girls. Whether this means they were warriors, I don't know. I'd like to see, I think some of the Russian stuff, you have graves that clearly are warrior women because of the pattern of on the skeletons show the kind of trauma that would be consistent with that.
And of course we have the Anglo-Saxon where we have that they nicknamed her Xena because it's two ladies buried together, and one of whom they would, when my husband was doing field archaeology as a student, they would have just said this was male because it's like 6 feet tall and it's buried with a sword and weapons and stuff. Yeah. When they did the DNA analysis, it was a very tall woman who was obvious from the skeleton had been a warrior, and she's buried with a much smaller woman.
That is pretty clear.
So they named the archaeologist named him Xena and Gabrielle, obviously.
Yeah.
And she was a little bit later. She was actually in the Saxon period. But my husband pointed out that she did fit everything you would need to be a warrior, which was brute strength.
Yes.
And he also observed that, at least in Ireland, women start falling out and actually are eventually sort of officially banned from warfare about the time you change from this sort of Bronze Age and early Iron Age display warfare where, yes, people get killed and it can get really bloody, but a lot of it is almost like counting coup. It's like doing somersaults off of chariots and going, nah, 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 over here.
Can see that.
And then suddenly it goes to just bash, hack, bash, hack, and you need brute strength to do it. So a lot of women simply, it would have been difficult for them to have done that style of fighting.
We've seen in the Society for Creative Anachronism that it is perfectly possible for women to be heavy fighters, but they really, really have to work at it and keep training. And Steve Sterling in his books does a really good job of explaining just what kind of training women have to do to be equals in that kind of warfare.
So anyway, getting back to
what titles?
The series starts with a book called Dies the Fire.
Oh, it's those books.
Those books, yes. They're great.
Which I will hopefully put a link up also on the webpage for this for anybody interested. Yeah. But sort of probably to bring it around, and I know it's getting kind of late, so we probably want to wrap up fairly soon, but I'd like to at least learn a little bit more about Herver here.
Well, the Herver saga is one of the more romantic, fantastical sagas. And one of the reasons is that the first part of it chronologically, in terms of internal chronology, is clearly set at the beginning of the Viking period, whereas the second part of it is based on incidents which occurred when the Huns invaded Western Europe, which was about several centuries earlier. And the people who are active in that are the grandchildren of Hervor, who's the hero in the first part. But that aside, so in the version that I'm working on, we're not going to go to the second part. That's just too much to deal with. But she is described as basically being the ultimate tomboy and very unhappy with the woman's role. And when she finally gets to the point where she's holding up travelers as they pass through the forest, and where this first part is set is at the bottom of Lake Ladoga. It's right at the head of the major river trade routes down from Scandinavia to Byzantium. And so if my conclusion is she was holding up travelers, they were probably traders, and her grandfather, who's the local Jarl, had a reason to be upset because it would really mess up all of the relationships and treaties and the money that taxes they were paying him to go through his land. Anyway, so he basically grabs her and says, what about this? And she says, okay, look, fit me out like a boy and I'll leave. And they're all very happy to do this. So she goes off. She has, at this point, just found out that her actual father was a berserker who had a magic sword, and he's buried on Samsey Isle, which is incidentally the same place that Odin used to hang out with the witches. So clearly Samsey Isle was a major thing.
Where is Samsey Isle?
It's off the coast of Denmark. And it doesn't look like much as you pass it on the ferry, but it clearly had a reputation. So her father and his brothers, all of whom were also berserkers, were all buried there after coming out of the losing side of a duel. So she is all dressed up in armor, and she makes her way to Samsey Isle. She actually comes across some Vikings and manages to become the captain of the Viking band. Good stuff. And she gets them to land her on the island. And she goes up to her father's grave mound and says, I want the sword. Well, he's a berserker, so he's already a little kind of magical, and besides, it's a grave mound, and besides, it's that kind of a saga. And so he answers her from the grave mound, which is not actually that uncommon in sagas now that I think of it. And he says, you don't want this sword, it's cursed. It's cursed because the guy who originally got the dwarves to make it, the dwarf cursed it before we gave it to him, who's an ancestor, and it's cursed with being a kinslayer. It will kill somebody of your own blood, eventually. She says, I don't care about my descendants, I want the sword now, because I'm going to be a great hero. And they have this wonderful conversation, and which is preserved from an older work and was inserted into the saga. And so he eventually gives up and gives her the sword, and she goes back and finds that there's like magic fires and thunder and all kinds of stuff going on while this is happening. And by the time she gets back to the shore, her heroic Vikings have been scared off and sailed away. So eventually she finds another ship, and she ends up in the far north in a land which is fairly magical. And she eventually gets into trouble there, but in the meantime, that king has a son. Everybody except the king, who's very wise, thinks she's a boy. When she gets into trouble and she leaves, and the king says, don't follow her, actually she's a girl. And the son says, oh, really? Oh, that's why I'm so attracted. Well, he doesn't say that in the saga, but that's what I'm reading into it. Anyway, he does follow her. She goes back home, and he follows her. She goes back home and tries to be a girl again. He goes back home, he follows her, and persuades her to marry him. And that's where I'm going to have to end my story. But unfortunately, what does end up happening is they have two sons, and one takes after her and one takes after him. And the one that's more like her ends up killing his brother. And so he has to leave town. So he's the one who ends up down in Hunland and
With the sword.
And one of his sons kills the other with the sword.
Right. So that's. I have one more kind of question, because I think this it sort of edges into it, and I think people would be interested. Can you explain a little bit more about berserkers, what that means and what that was?
Okay, they're actually, even today there are some people who have anger management problems. So a berserker was a Viking warrior with serious anger management problems.
But nowadays they get therapy instead of putting on bear skins.
And if they were also big and strong and skilled and coordinated, they could use that in battle. And so they would put them in the front row.
And blame it on Odin.
Yeah, and they would, Odin governs all kinds of altered states. Some of them we like, some of them we don't like. And,
Would that make him the god of getting drunk or high?
Yeah, actually.
Oh, interesting.
But also getting ecstatic through dance or poetry or meditation.
He's kind of edgy.
The above. He's the god. His name, the root of his name, really to me translates as ecstasy. Sometimes translated as madness, but it's that furious excitement.
Yeah, there's another interview that can be found on my site with my husband where we talk about the furious host and the woad host, and that's sort of echoes of, that's very Odinic as well. So it's this kind of both madness and ecstasy, and sometimes there's not a really fine line between them. One can flip into the other pretty easily, which is one reason I was asking about the berserkers, because they sort of...
So, they'd be in the front line, and everybody kind of left them, gave them some space. And they would beat on their shields and maybe chew on them, according to some stories, and then go, into battle. And they were, by this time, in such an altered state that they didn't feel their wounds. And now some of them would also go into this state when it was not appropriate and kill people. With Egil Skallagrimsson, who is also one of the chief poets of the saga period, was also a berserker, and as a young boy killed one of his playmates because he got into this state.
And I think my husband pointed out in the interview we did with him that as a very old man, this was a very physical transformation. I mean, I'm sure a modern psychologist or psychiatrist would have some sort of name for this condition, but it wasn't always totally within their control. And as a very old man, Ale goes into one of these fits of rage over something and actually dies as the result of kind of the physical backlash, because his body's just too old to handle that kind of rage, which I think even today you occasionally find people who can. We can.
We've all known some.
But that would be another interview. Well, I want to ask before we go, do you have any websites or anything you'd like to share?
The Hrafnar website is www.hrafnar.org, and my own website is Diana_Paxon. www.dianapaxon.net, I think.
I'll have it listed. Yeah, you can email it to me and I can list it. But this has been a wonderful interview. I'd like to thank Esther for being here with us, asking all her wonderful questions. And I'd like to thank you, Diana, for spending some time with us. And I look forward in the future to having you back again at some point. Okay, everyone, I think that's good night for now. Be with us next time for Cat's Eye on the Future.
But here's a health to the company and one to my lass.
You have been listening to Cat's Eye on the Future, the show where we take a glimpse of the energies coming soon into your world and into your future. Be sure to join us again next time when we explore another chapter of Cat's Eye on the Future.
Again. But here's a health to the company and one to my lass. Let's drink and be merry all out of one glass. Let's drink and be merry